Hello, everyone. It's the top of the hour, so I believe we will begin. Good morning. This is Alexander Chang, and I will be starting us off today. I am a senior member of the technical staff at the Aerospace Corporation, serving as the Associate Program Chair for the System Engineering Forum. It is my pleasure to welcome you today. With me this morning is Al Hohab, my co-chair for this year's events. He'll be helping me to monitor chat. Also in the background is our Corp Comm production team, and I welcome them and their help across the series. Next slide, please. The System Engineering Forum is a series of events that we kicked off this year, hosted by our Corporate Chief Engineer's Office. The concentration is really on MBSE and digital engineering, as well as digital acquisition and how it is applied across the space enterprise, contributing to mission success while fulfilling the vision of digital engineering and digital acquisition. In the past, we have had face-to-face events. However, we've gone virtual, as have most other forums. We're planning to go virtual again in 2022. Our fiscal year starts in October, so you can look forward to some different talks starting in October of this year. These talks may apply to a wide range of participants, so they're listed below. The materials are clear for public release, so you can reuse them as you see fit. And they're going to be posted in the System Engineering Forum's archives. So if you look on the website, you can click on the archive site and see the reference materials for not only this talk, but previous talks as well. This includes, This includes videos, presentations, and any background materials such as cleared papers or reports. The videos are also going to be available on the Aerospace YouTube video channel, so you can look forward to that and replay it from there. Next slide, please. Today's talk is an outbriefing on the Design for Principles workshop with Dr. Erin Ryan. And we have one more outbriefing this fiscal year on our model-based mission assurance and flight worthiness workshop on September 14th. Next slide, please. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording this event, so your mics have been muted. Please keep your cameras off. That'll save bandwidth to make sure we can accommodate the demand. In the chat box, you will see instructions if you need help on either reconnecting or how to use chat. So I would recommend downloading them now. The chat is pretty standard, so you can either communicate to the whole group or to a specific person. We're going to handle questions at the end, but you are more than welcome to post your questions in the chat. So Al Hohab and I will be monitoring that to see if you can provide administrative answers during the outbriefing. Next slide, please. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our workshop lead today. Dr. Erin Ryan is a senior project engineer in the Aerospace Corporation's Defense Systems Group. For over 2 decades, he has been involved with various aspects of DoD space capability development, including architecting, engineering and design, acquisitions, and operations. He holds a PhD in system engineering from the Air Force Institute of Technology, where he first became passionate about the need for design flexibility. Take it away, Erin.
All right, thanks, Alex. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for being here. All right, let's go to the next slide, Sarah. All right, like Alex said, we convened a workshop a couple of months back on designing for principles, and we invited some key players from across the space community. We had participation from the U.S. Space Force, OSD, NASA, NRO, not to mention some key aerospace leaders and thought leaders who support different parts of the space community. The primary purpose of the workshop was really threefold. We wanted to get the word out on DFP and help folks understand what it is. We wanted to get some critical feedback on it, both the merits of the approach itself, as well as the viability of being able to implement it. And 3, we wanted to figure out the next steps is if there is something here that's worthwhile, what do we do about it? So that's really why we had the workshop. And let's go to the next slide. Here's the agenda from the workshop. This is really just here for reference. I'm not going to walk through this, but I wanted to note it was pretty lengthy. It was several hours long. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank again all those who contributed their time and their brain power to this event. Thank you. right, let's go to the next slide. So in line with that first goal, the first part of the workshop agenda was focused on just understanding what DFP is and how it's different from traditional systems engineering. Today, I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version over these next few slides. Let's go to the next slide, slide 5. So first, this discussion was largely a summary of the paper published toward the end of last year by the Aerospace Center for Space Policy and Strategy. As noted here, DFP can really be regarded as an alternate capability development approach, something that stands in contrast to the traditional DoD systems engineering methodology. The paper itself is intentionally pretty provocative. It questions many of the core assumptions regarding how we should be doing capability development across the space enterprise. And although DFP is theoretically applicable to any capability development activity, I think there are a number of reasons why it's tailor-made for the Space Force at this moment of time. So that's largely been the focus. All right, let's go to slide 6. And these were the main points of designing for principles that we walk through in the first part of that workshop. These 5 banners represent really the basic arguments of the first paper, the story in a nutshell. So the first point is systems engineering as practiced in the DoD certainly has provided incredible value for a long time, enabling the fielding of complicated, sophisticated capabilities that would simply not have been possible without the principles design approach of traditional systems engineering. Second point, though, is that systems engineering is far from perfect. It has some notable deficiencies, many of which we know about, but we often will ignore or forget them. So in particular, systems engineering, especially as practiced in the DoD, has a major Achilles heel, and that is the VUCA environment. And VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And systems engineering effectiveness is hugely diminished amidst the increased prevalence of complexity and high degrees of uncertainty. So as the uncertainty increases, I'm on the third banner now, systems engineering deficiencies become more apparent. That naturally leads one to wonder, is there perhaps a better way to handle uncertainty, to more explicitly incorporate flexibility considerations into the capability development process as the merely complicated gives way to the truly complex in our world? Turns out that the basis of such an approach already exists and has for a while. It's called design for changeability. It emphasizes particular design principles like flexibility, adaptability, modularity. What I've done is essentially extend and generalize the core idea of design for changeability into a more robust approach to architecture and design suited for the DoD, and I call it design for principles, or DFP. Last banner now, number 5. The DFP is quite a bit different from traditional systems engineering, but in an environment like today's space domain, which is clearly very VUCA, a DFP approach may be an ideal fit. So that's the summary of DFP. A key premise here on slide 7 is acknowledging that the world has changed enormously since the advent of systems engineering. Take a moment, if you will, to digest this quote from Jamshidi in his book, Systems of Systems Engineering, regarding the state of systems engineering in a more complex world. There's a lot of wisdom packed in here. Yeah, you've got this idea of many of the premises underlying traditional systems engineering are no longer valid, what it focuses on. Let me call your attention kind of midway through where it starts. These strategies incorrectly assume that all of the systems of systems requirements are known in the beginning of the development process and can be frozen in time or assumed to be stable. Think about that for a moment. That's exactly right for the vast majority of acquisitions based on the DoD systems engineering process. Everything is based on getting the requirements right at the outset, establishing a long and detailed list of verifiable requirements, delivering on those fixed requirements, and of course, doing everything we can to avoid changes to those requirements as the acquisition proceeds. That can definitely work in a stable environment largely characterized by known knowns, maybe a sprinkling of known unknowns, but it will axiomatically not work in a VUCA environment with lots of unknown unknowns. All right, let's go to the next slide now. Sorry, thanks. So again, the world has fundamentally changed since the inception of systems engineering. Let's talk about what this means relative to the concept of complexity. So for thousands of years, things that humans made really weren't that complicated. You know, maybe there was the Roman aqueducts or the pyramids or a telescope, a cotton gin, or the Wright flyer. In those instances, the entire system could be easily understood. You know, maybe it took a lot of effort to put together. Maybe it took insight and innovation, but that system could be understood, often built and operated by a single person. Things obviously changed in a big way right around the mid portion of the 20th century, where you've got things like the expansive nature of Bell Labs projects in the 40s, the groundbreaking Atlas rockets of the 50s, or the massively intricate and impressive space shuttle of the 60s and 70s. With these advents, it was no longer possible to manage these systems in the mind of a single person. Plus, we had to account for armies of personnel and millions of dollars and various bureaucratic processes. So we needed a way to manage all these complicated pieces across the life cycle. Thus, SE was born. But like this slide says, there is a crucial difference between complicated and complex. In casual discussions, complexity is used as a synonym for complicated, but within the fields of systems theory, ops research, the two concepts are very much distinct. A complicated system will certainly consist of many parts and there are processes that have intricate interactions, but the elements of a complicated system are finite. Their interactions are relatively few in number. They can be characterized such that the system outputs can be reliably predicted based on the inputs. Complex systems, however, not only tend to have more parts and their processes, but crucially, the number of interactions is generally much greater. And the nature of those interactions is often nonlinear, unpredictable, sometimes chaotic. You get emergent behaviors. Knowing the inputs does not allow us to determine the output. So what this means is that complicated systems can generally be decomposed where complex systems cannot. Or to put it another way, complicated systems are generally subject to the core tenet of systems engineering, reductionism. And the whole SEV is predicated on the notion that we can break down problems into more manageable chunks and then put them back together. It also assumes that we can predict and model the world and all the associated uncertainties. But the gestalt of a truly complex system means the holistic behavior cannot be reliably discerned by summing the parts, nor can we reliably predict outputs from inputs or fully characterize the constituent uncertainties. This is a major change. This is the heart of a VUCA concept. So which world do we live in today? Well, are we still dealing with merely complicated reductionist world, or has the world changed fundamentally? If it is a complex world, what do we do about it? Well, just like we needed a new approach in the last century, and like what General McChrystal says here, we need a new approach. All right, next slide, please. So the basis of the new approach is potentially designing for principles. The core idea of DFP can be captured with these 4 pillars. You got number 1, first and foremost, we have to kick our requirements habit. Requirements are the currency of a stable, predictable world, not the VUCA world. We need to use fewer requirements. We need to replace requirements with objectives where possible, especially at the higher levels. And we need to have the right kind of requirements, particularly with respect to what are called non-functional requirements or ILADs, like flexibility, adaptability, interoperability, survivability, that kind of thing. Second, we have to keep the big picture in mind in all aspects of what we do in the capability development process. Continually emphasize the broader perspective of capabilities over systems, not be so platform centric. Our obsession with individual systems has to end, and we have to extend this thinking to all facets of development, including performance, resilience, risk, and decision-making. A system survivability is almost meaningless. It's the persistence of a capability that truly matters as part of a warfighting environment. Third, we have to truly embrace and understand uncertainty. Currently, we expend an insane amount of resources on trying to manage risk, transfer it, avoid it, mitigate it. And we have to because we can't tolerate risk as part of the principal design process. But if that's the nature of the world, that there's all this uncertainty, maybe we would be a lot better off accepting it, designing our systems to better cope with it. And regardless, we could be a lot smarter about how we deal with risk in general and how we mathematically characterize uncertainty. Finally, we just need to go fast. We need to prioritize speed of capability development to supplant the stagnation cycle that we are so often stuck in and replace it with a celerity cycle, a speed cycle that enables agility. And this is more than saying we want to go fast. This is actually making schedule a critical parameter over performance and delivering capabilities on short established increments, no matter what. And that brings all sorts of other benefits that are in line with prioritizing principles of design. All right, let's go to the next slide. So another way to understand what DFP is all about is to compare it directly to traditional systems engineering. The next two charts do this. This one shows the two approaches side by side with the intent of highlighting key differences with respect to certain design elements. So relative to technical performance, the traditional SC approach, the principal design approach, is going to be optimized for known functional performance requirements. It's all about the sensor resolution and coverage, and it's really the best option if the current circumstances or the assumptions remain valid. Under a DFP-based approach, you're going to get reduced performance relative to the current circumstances and assumptions, but generally superior performance for a broader range of possibilities that may or may not be foreseen. And so it emphasizes these abilities to help enable that. In terms of the requirements, under a traditional systems engineering approach, you're going to get a large number. You're going to specify as much as possible, including thresholds of acceptable performance. The overarching question is generally, do we have everything we need? Under DFP, requirements are going to be fewer in number, or in some cases not used. You specify only what matters and you prioritize the objectives of what you want to achieve over traditional requirements. And the question becomes more, do we need everything we have? That more parsimonious approach. In terms of interfaces, under traditional SC, you get highly integrated with tight coupling between the elements. You tend to be functionally monolithic, system-centric. Those intra-system interfaces become the focus. Under DFP, much more modular, interoperable, loose coupling between the elements, functionally disaggregated, and then the interfaces between the systems are more the focus to keep that big picture in mind. Resilience to known threats. Typically on major systems, there's going to be some resilience to known threats, assuming that all systems meet their allocated requirements. The enterprise will perform as the sum of its parts. Under DFP, you can get resilience to known threats at any level, but typically you're focusing more on the enterprise, assuming that emergent behavior recognizes that abilities can generally best be met at the enterprise level. So instead of focusing on the survivability of a platform and hardening it or increasing its maneuverability, you would instead focus on things like proliferation, disaggregation, entanglement, those types of things where all the systems are working together in a more coherent way. In terms of resilience to unknown threats, it's extremely low under the traditional SC process because it doesn't take that into account. It wants to optimize for the known requirements. DFP, by nature of the abilities, is bound to have some degree of resilience to the unknown threats. The flexible implementations are going to foster the ability to survive a broader range of threats, even if they're not anticipated, and the approach becomes a little more threat agnostic. So in summary, from a design consideration, the traditional ST approach tends to be quite a bit more reactive, downplays uncertainty, assumes stability and resources, the requirements, and the threat environment. The emphasis is on near-term, exquisite technical performance and efficiency. Contrast that with DFP, where it's a more proactive approach and embraces uncertainty. It expects the unexpected. In fact, the more uncertain things are, the more it makes sense to invest in those abilities. And the emphasis is on a more networked adaptability, long-term, good enough technical performance. All right, let's go to the next slide. So the previous table was domain agnostic. This one is specific to the space domain, which is again, been the focus of DFP. I won't walk through this slide in as much detail, but maybe just highlight some of these key points related to architectures and how the designs would manifest themselves in a space enterprise. There's going to be a lot more, as you look down these two columns, you see a lot more emphasis on the right side in specific techniques related to disaggregation, proliferation, enabling foundational capabilities versus mission stovepipes, such that you have versatile, flexible ground sites that aren't able to just support one particular mission, but can be much more fungible across the design architecture. So same idea for ground sites, communications, all those segments of the space architecture. All right, next slide. Let's switch gears now. So whereas the first paper was really about what DFP is, talking about why it's needed, how it's different from what we do today, it's still fairly abstract. So the second paper tries to get more concrete, translating the ideas into a set of actionable recommendations. And then this was the second major point of discussion at the workshop. Let's try to make this a little more real. So next slide, please. So this paper is due out soon. I'm thinking now next month, most likely. Again, available through the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. It has a series of recommended actions to include the rationale and specific actors for those recommendations. The scope is definitely ambitious. It involves not just requirements, major changes to the requirements process, the acquisition process, but personnel strategies, budget resourcing changes. And some of the changes can be implemented at the program level. Others would require actions by Headquarters Space Force, even OSD in some cases. And there are a couple cases that would require congressional action to bring all of this together. And those are all noted, who the actionees are. All right, let's go to the next slide, Sarah. All right, here again, just by way of review are the 4 DFP pillars. I'm showing these again because the recommendations in the paper are organized by pillar, such that there are 6 specific recommendations associated with each of the pillars for a total of 24 implementation recommendations. And the next 4 slides list these 6 recommendations associated with each pillar. So let's start with that. Let's go next slide, slide 15. And so given today's more of an overview of what happened in the workshop, I'm not going to walk through all the recommendations in detail, but what I thought I'd do is highlight a couple on each slide to give you a sense of what's here. So for this first pillar of not being obsessed with requirements, the key idea is to significantly cut back on requirements, use objectives where possible, like I mentioned earlier, allow for greater flexibility in the design trade space. So for this to have any chance of working though, there's going to need to be more extensive communication between developers and users, for instance. This would be number 2 on the chart. Today, it wouldn't be unusual for a program to receive user requirements early on and then spend a decade or more in a figurative corner developing a system to meet those requirements without any further conversation with the user. And then, one day, a long time later, typically the developer shows up and asks the user to come test or even use the system that has been developed, assuming that the user's needs have not changed in the intervening time. This really isn't a good practice in general and would likely be fatal for an objectives-based approach. Instead, there should be extensive and ongoing engagement between the user and the developer to ensure that the developer remains focused on what the users care about and the user remains apprised of the status of the activity. So this becomes really powerful when combined with number 3 on the chart, this rapid incremental development and getting test articles out there. Another change we would need to make is much greater emphasis on competition. This is the single most powerful force for innovation that humanity has, competition. We don't use it enough. Yes, we mandate it for MDAPs, Major Defense Acquisition Programs, up to milestone B, but we really need it for all efforts and we need it across the life cycle. Moreover, we ought to consider extending it to government agencies. If done on a selective basis with some basic precautions to avoid unnecessary duplication of efforts, this could also yield competitive efficiencies. So that gives you a flavor of the kind of recommendations related to Pillar 1. Let's go to the next slide, Pillar 2. Let's talk mostly about the second recommendation here, architecture as a service. So this deliberately flips the design paradigm away from the missions to the enabling functions that allow every space mission to succeed, even those we may not know about today. The idea here is to once and for all break the stovepipe mentality that dominates our architectures by emphasizing cross-cutting foundational capabilities that underpin all space mission areas, things like command and control, data transport, data management, logistics and sustainment, operations. Within the current JSIDS process that provides really largely siloed capability development documents, programs of record are necessarily going to be predisposed toward developing custom solutions for each of those common functions, such that over time, the enterprise becomes burdened with a patchwork of mission unique architecture enclaves for things that really ought to be shared from an efficiency perspective and a survivability perspective. This is exactly how we get processing and storage facilities that can only handle one particular type of mission data. It's how we get C2 software that only works with one set and oftentimes a specific number of satellites. It's how we get satellites that are incompatible with standard launch interfaces, or communication networks and data standards that preclude us from talking and understanding one another. The bottom line is we need to provision the architecture to provide these foundational capabilities as common enterprise services to all of the missions. And this is a potentially revolutionary notion because it switches the focus from a disconnected set of stovepipe missions to an integrated set of capability utilities that can provide a single foundation that each mission can effectively plug into or subscribe to. This is what is meant by architecture as a service. And the concept is not only more cost effective and combat effective in the aggregate, it's arguably the only way that we can develop a truly integrated enterprise. And it's the only way to achieve flexibility at the capability level. By that, I mean, obviously we have a plan for the set of missions we do today, PNT, missile warning, environmental monitoring. What happens tomorrow when the Space Force is asked to do global troop transport or asteroid interdiction or lunar defense? We need to have an architecture that allows us to rapidly pivot toward the capabilities needed, and creating a whole new stovepipe isn't the answer. So obviously all that has connections to things like number 3 and 4 on this page, how the resources are applied, how accountability is established, but it requires us to rethink where and how that will be done. And that's always a contentious topic. All right, let's go to slide 17. Pillar 3. So there are a host of relatively straightforward things we can do here related to embracing and understanding uncertainty, ranging from stepping away from our bias toward risk and expanding our focus beyond just risk management to more holistic uncertainty management. If we're going to be more agile, take smart risks, seize opportunities, and understand how they're all related, we have to consider the spectrum of uncertainty in our decision making, not just risk. And we can certainly use much more mathematically valid means of characterizing and managing uncertainty. This is related to like number 2 and number 3 on the chart. We need to commit to stopping the, dare I say, comically simplistic approach to uncertainty that is prevalent today with the ubiquitous risk matrix. There are much better techniques that are appropriate for that. And we need to foster broader appreciation of uncertainty away from single program conceptions of cost, schedule, and technical. This gets to number 4 and 5 on the chart. First, we have to routinely incorporate the operational perspective into our calculus using something like the continuous user engagement recommendation from the first pillar. We need to account for the operational risks in concert with the acquisition risks. It can be the case that the warfighter would much prefer a 50% solution in 6 months versus waiting for 100% of the capability that's due in 5 years. That has to be integrated into our development strategy, that kind of thinking. We also need to keep our focus, again, on capabilities versus systems. So imagine a scenario where we've chartered 4 programs to deliver this high-risk capability as part of a deliberate strategy to respond to some new critical operational need. If we were to assume that the chance of any individual program delivering this capability is 50%, that would certainly be an extremely high risk from the program kind of local perspective. But as long as each of the programs is fully independent, the chance that at least one of those programs succeeds is 94%, which is great. So you can look at risk differently from across the enterprise rather than just the program perspective. All right, let's go to slide 18. And here are the recommendations related to the 4th pillar. Let me sort of talk about all these at once by addressing the common theme. And the common theme, the problem is we are essentially stuck in a cycle of self-reinforcing stagnation, or as Polakowski and Doug Lavero have called it, the vicious cycle of space acquisition. So what that means, if you haven't heard that, is basically the longer it takes to build a satellite system, the more that we become invested in its success, and the more reliable and the more exquisite these satellites must be. That translates to larger satellites, which in turn is to drive even higher levels of reliability, even more performance enhancements. Hey, let's add this capability, let's add this, all to the point of increasingly diminishing returns. Even worse, I would add to that the stagnation cycle isn't confined to just that one system. The risk of loss for that system becomes so unacceptable that innovation is effectively stifled across the board, and virtually all reasonable risk trades are huge amounts of time and money on infallible launch vehicles and elaborate protection schemes to pair with the exquisite vehicles. We have this huge investment. We have to make additional investments because we can't afford its loss. And with each circuit of that stagnation cycle, we actually increase the overall fragility of the space architecture. So the alternative is to switch things around, this idea of a celerity cycle. The core premise here is to prioritize schedule over technical performance so that we work until the time expires. We deliver whatever performance, whatever capability we have at that time. That switches the feedback loop from negative to positive. Rather than the stagnation cycle, we have the speed cycle. Less time developing the system translates to less cost. The reduced investment in time and money means that failures are not as critical because we can quickly have a flying experience, like a Mike Pence moment here, sorry. This reduces the investment in time and money and means that failures are not as critical because we can quickly learn, we can try again, we can turn to parallel development paths. We can, and these parallel paths are suddenly much more commonplace because the budget is not being sucked into what's effectively a programmatic black hole. In fact, the rapid incremental development efforts can create their own ecosystem that feeds on itself, where other rapid incremental developments can thrive, further reducing the impact of failure because there are other options. That in turn makes stakeholders more willing to wait until the next capability increment instead of forcing everything into the current one, which keeps that. Are coming more quickly. There's really little justification to expend so many resources on system longevity or protection of exquisite assets. That allows us to go even faster. So you turn everything around. That's the idea of all right, next slide, please. All right, so that really was the summary of the major content of the workshop. I want to spend the last couple slides talking about what came out of it, some of the major findings and discussion points. So in terms of those major findings, there was certainly broad consensus on the need for change, that the environment has fundamentally changed. What we're doing today isn't working, isn't agile enough, doesn't respond to uncertainty sufficiently. Gotta move faster.
Erin, your voice is kind of low at the moment.
Okay. Let's see. I have my own gain turned up as high as possible. Is this all right?
Okay.
And my mic close to my mouth. How's that?
That seems to be fine. You seem to be dropping in and out a little bit, so I guess be aware of that.
Okay. Copy. Thanks, Alex. So broad recognition of the problem. Whether DFP is the answer, certainly less clear. There's recognition that it's probably premature to regard it as a true methodology. It's in its infancy relative to something like systems engineering, which is extremely mature. It's got hundreds of pages in the DAG to talk about it. This has some charts and a couple of papers. Regardless, DFP could serve as a means to shift paradigms on capability development, perhaps push, at a minimum, push traditional systems engineering toward this dream of agile systems engineering, or better allow it to evolve to better respond to a VUCA world. And no one thinks that DFP could or even should entirely replace systems engineering. There's absolutely a place for systems engineering. DFP makes much more sense at the higher levels of design and architecture. By that, I mean, it's one thing to say we ought to have an objective for worldwide coverage as a performance parameter and be willing to accept 80% coverage on the first iteration. That's a very different thing from saying that, hey, the input voltage on the component has to be 5 volts and be willing to accept 4 volts. In some instances, you have to have hard requirements. And even if DFP is the way that we need to go and the implementation recommendations all make sense, there are some significant obstacles to making it happen. For instance, there is a lot of coherence and interdependence among the recommendations such that there ought to be a coordinated plan on doing this, but there's really no single champion for all the requirements, budgeting and acquisition pieces to come together. Similarly, the nature of DFP, which is inherently high level, it's enterprise focused, is somewhat less good fit for some sort of small scale prototyping. It doesn't make sense to do this on a program by program basis, because the idea is changing how the programs fit together and getting rid of those stovepipes. So if you're going to manage risks, requirements, and capabilities across the enterprise, we need to think about it more broadly. It's conceivable, as we discussed in the workshop, it could potentially be something to be adopted by a Sparco or SDA type organization. And of course, there are some sacred cows at risk. DFP calls for significant changes for how budgeting is done, who controls it. It reduces the power of individual programs. It increases competition across the board. It encourages failure to truly innovate and so on. So a couple of these changes would even require congressional action, which isn't easy even under the best of conditions, let alone what we have today. On the other hand, there are some reasons to be optimistic that we talked about. Certainly we are at an inflection point right now. The Space Force is still less than 2 years old. We have a generational opportunity. It's a small service, it's nimble, it's clearly committed to doing things different and maybe slaying some sacred cows. And the Space Force itself represents a tiny fraction of the overall DoD budget. So if we as a country are ever to affect some meaningful change, now is the moment, and we have this great opportunity. All right, let's go to slide 20. This is the last slide presentation that I'll open up for questions. This is the next steps. We talked a little bit about how some related efforts are underway, mostly just coincidentally that overlap with this. There are draft enterprise requirements that have already been developed as part of force design work. There is the establishment of Section 804, middle tier acquisition. That's being encouraged and used, which is all about going much faster. There's capability development, IPT, taking a hard look at the requirements process. There have been discussion at senior levels of leadership about what it would mean to compete with different organizations. And there's the vision for a digital service that was released a couple of months ago. And that's all about making the service digital and how digital engineering will play a key role in all of this. So a lot of things are happening to start moving us in this direction. We've also looked to establish some connections at some obvious touch points, like what's called strategic foresighting. That's an aerospace effort that is really a structured approach to better plan for a VUCA world. And we've also had direct engagement with the force design team and the broader Space Warfighting Analysis Center on DFP. We've also talked about some other low-hanging fruit we could pursue, like a complete rewrite of the DoD Risk Management Guide, an effort to quantify non-functional requirements like flexibility, survivability, and interoperability in order to make those requirements have teeth, or formally release the enterprise requirements. At this point, it's still just a draft concept. So that concludes the briefing on DFP. Before I open it up for questions, I'm going to close with this quote in the bottom right, which is taken from the markup language in the current Defense Appropriations Bill. I saw this a couple weeks ago. I would offer that in this, where it says, the committee remains concerned that the Air Force has not taken more aggressive action in addressing longstanding space acquisition issues and has made little progress in defining what the Space Force will be doing that is fundamentally different than when it was a component of the Air Force. So there's still a concern out there that we haven't made meaningful change, and there's perhaps, again, some interest, some genuine interest in Congress to see that change. So it's easy to say Congress won't do things, but when you see words like this, there's reason to believe that they might be willing to change. So DFP could potentially serve as an excellent roadmap for such change that is fundamentally different. All right, so I will open up for questions. I'll take a look in the chat.
Hi, yeah, Erin. So I guess we'll start at the very first one. Monty had a question on what has to be broken to move from a traditional requirement ASOC mindset to one that enables the abilities to be the focus. This was in reference to page 9. And Bill Bishop also had a similar kind of idea that I'll address later. But do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, and obviously there wasn't time to get into the details in some of this, but it essentially starts with the JSIDS process, which is all about trying to capture the requirements, lock them down, and unfortunately, we build in the stovepiping right from the beginning. Folks who've lived this world know that CDDs, capability development documents, typically tend to be program-centric, program-specific. Even though it's a capability development document, it's assigned to a single program. That's the beginning of the problem. There needs to be an actual articulation of the capability need and allow the services more trade space. I apologize for my dog if you can hear that in the background. More ability of the services to actually figure out how to best meet that requirement in aggregate so that they could get multiple CDDs that are truly capability based. So you're not getting a SBIR CDD, you're getting, say, a missile warning, missile detection CDD. You're getting a PNT CDD rather than a GPS CDD. And you take all those in aggregate and you figure out the best way to meet those. Oh, look at the common elements that have to be provided for these things. They all need data transport. They all need data management. Let's figure out how to best meet them as an enterprise. And that necessarily also is going to have budget implications because programs can't the money can't go directly to programs. The money needs to go to capabilities.
Thank you. The next question is from Alex. Has DFP been introduced as a result of the SE evolution or as an alternate to SE approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that as much as it might be tempting to describe it as an alternate, and I've certainly done so, it may make more sense to think of it as an evolution, because that's fundamentally less disruptive. Systems engineering is well entrenched, well understood. And if we think that these changes are the kind of things we need to do because the world has changed and we need to think about complexity rather than just the merely complicated challenges of the past, it's easier to adapt an existing known quantity than it is to replace it with a completely different unknown. But I think it's almost like a branding marketing discussion.
Thank you. Next question is from Bill with a comment as well from Monty. Again, so de-emphasizing formal requirements provides flexibility, but what do you recommend when a vendor is failing to satisfy customer expectations for objectives and principles? How does contracting and program management change to avoid contract haggling over literal wording when the lawyers get involved? And this is also in reference from Monty, back to his original question on what needs to be broken in the current approach to enable this sort of approach.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's the most logical flaw in this idea of, wait, requirements. If we don't have requirements, how do we ensure accountability? How do we ensure that what we deliver at the end of this has value? If you just rely on the idea of an objective, here's where we want to go, how can you be sure that we're squeezing the best out of the process, whether that is the government agencies, the people, the prime contractors, whatever. And that's where these ideas of, basically there's three pieces of it. One, the communication with the user and make sure we understand what's needed so that we have the flexibility to move, to adjust as needed. But that doesn't necessarily get you the accountability. The two things that really get you to accountability are the rapid incremental delivery of capabilities. Today, we have these massive requirement structures and requirement documents that go on contract, and we spend a decade or more making sure that that's what we deliver on. It would never work for us to say, OSD, here's a bunch of money, I'll give it to you, program, come back to me in 10 years and deliver on these objectives. But if instead they have to deliver an increment every year, some sort of MVP, some minimum viable products, some capability under the agile concept, that changes things. That's a little more reasonable. Now the accountability begins to become more real because you have to deliver something on a short timeline. And there's really nothing better in terms of validation than having a product you can deliver to the user and get feedback. That's superior to any massive bureaucratic process and milestone decisions. You're actually doing the real world kind of stuff. You combine that with competition, with the other piece of it. And so to answer the question probably as directly as I can, what do you do when a vendor fails to satisfy the customer expectations? Well, you go talk with the other vendor and see if they're doing better, or the other two vendors. Or maybe there's, again, SMC was struggling to do this, but Sparco was trying to do the same thing. You go that route. Everybody is competing to deliver the capability as best they can toward that objective as quickly as they can.
Great, thank you. So there was a question on what does it mean to have a firm fixed price contract. I provided a resource to that, but I mentioned it is essentially a contract type that cannot be adjusted. Do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's a good part of discussion worth having as to what type of contract mechanisms make the most sense in this type of environment. And again, there's going to be a need for some hard requirements. And in those instances where you understand and you don't expect there to be any changes, well, firm fixed price makes more sense. In those cases where there's more uncertainty, then different types of contract structures, more of the cost plus models are going to make more sense. So I think it depends.
Right, thank you. The next question is, what does this mean for, oh, sorry, what does this mean for technology-free states? I assume that flexibility is part of the lore. What about risk management?
I'm not sure what that means. So Steve, if you're still on the line and you are able to unmute, maybe you could expand a little bit on what a technology-free state is in this context.
Well, there's a lot of these big programs, they have these, freeze dates of when we're going to introduce new technology, or they're slinging around TRLs or something.
Okay.
I remember when the Hubble replacement came in, we saw this massive improvement in images. Turns out 20% of it was fixing the optics and 80% of it was new CCD technology that we're able to use. So it seems to me one big power of this is in these long acquisition programs. I mean, a lot can happen in 10 years or even 5. So I assume the allure, as I called it, is to be able to be more flexible in the integration of new technology. But then, of course, that goes with risk. So that was maybe a longer.
Yeah, that's a great example too. We could talk about. There's a balance there. You mentioned Hubble. Hubble is not in terms of its mission, would probably not be very suitable for a DFP approach. It's largely a one-off, or a Martian rover type thing. It doesn't make sense probably to send 10 of those to Mars. There are still need in certain instances for absolutely exquisite high-risk activities, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff we do that doesn't need to be acquired in that way. And in those cases, I think the whole idea of a technology freeze date is just meaningless.
Agreed. Okay, thank you.
Okay, next, there's a lot of questions, so I'm very happy with this. Yeah.
All right.
In total, 24. And the next question is, in total, there are 24 recommendations. How do these recommendations align with each other in order to make a system? Please correct me if I didn't word that correct.
I'm with you. I'm seeing the text in the chat. So they don't align to make a system. And again, that's a major takeaway or a thrust of DFP is who cares about the system? What we care about is the capability. And maybe to try to answer the question more specifically, there's a lot of overlap in the recommendations, such that we just talked about the requirements and objectives. If you're going to take that kind of approach where you actually have objectives over requirements, we've got to make some other changes for that to work related to how requirements flow, when they become objectives, who controls them, how the funding works. So that again is, I think, some of the overwhelming nature of this when we've talked about it with folks across the community is, wow, yeah, that needs to be done. This needs to be done. But all this kind of needs to be done in a concerted effort. Who can pull this off? There's no single belly button across space that can make all this work together. And so although some things can be done at, say, the system level, the program level, in terms of how we do risk management, that's relatively easy. Some of this other stuff is big and is going to require buy-in at senior levels to pull off. And so that's daunting.
Great. Thank you. The next one from Paul, is there any data on the cost savings generated by schedule reduction or compression? Is there a rule of thumb for % savings over % schedule savings?
Wow, is there ever? So there are a whole bunch of studies out there, obviously, hundreds on cost overruns in the DoD and what drives them. And the two biggest factors that come up again and again are requirements changes, and we'll just say requirements problems, and they'll maybe lay that at the feet of requirements work wasn't done properly at the beginning and they didn't get it right, or they allowed it to change, or the technology they tried to use was not mature enough, and so they couldn't meet the requirements. So there's all that kind of stuff. And then there's schedule. There's absolutely a strong correlation between how long something takes and how much it costs. I mean, it's more reliable than the cost estimating relationship between satellite weight and satellite cost. So what's interesting, though, about that whole thing, if I kind of take that in a slightly different direction, is the analysis in these studies that talk about getting the requirements right, they assume that that's possible. They say if the programs would have just done a better job getting the requirements right, there wouldn't have been all this requirements flux, all this creep, and they would have done a better job. They don't make the almost obvious connection that, well, wait a second, if the program went quicker, if it, instead of 10, 15 years, it was 1 to 2 years, there would have been less opportunity for requirements to change. The environment wouldn't have changed, the technologies wouldn't have changed, the threats wouldn't have changed as much. That alone creates a stabilization to the baseline that better enables the program to succeed. So there's kind of an interesting duality there in the relationship between schedule and requirement stability. And if I didn't get to that right, please feel free to, if I didn't answer the actual question, please feel free to speak up.
Okay, then the next question from Steve. You keep referencing SE when you compare DFP. From what you were saying, couldn't it be deployed by other disciplines or product delivery types? Similarly, from Monty, how does DFP enable or coexist with DE? Perhaps that is a separate question.
Well, that's good. I think there is kind of a relationship there. And honestly, I think to some extent there's some, it's just a method of trying to anchor this to things that people understand and know today. This community knows systems engineering, everybody lives it. And so I try to kind of just for rhetorical purposes, compare DFP to systems engineering. And this kind of gets back to the other discussion, you know, maybe it's really just an extension. Maybe it's an evolution. Maybe it's a way to push it toward true agile SE. I'm not sure how to think about it. It is definitely different than what we do today. And whether that means there is some a whole new thing or it's just a modification, I'm not sure. And kind of to more Monty's question, enable coexist, yeah, I'll foot stomp again that idea. Systems engineering cannot go away anytime soon. There's a tremendous amount of goodness there, especially at the lower levels, that I think has to be retained for us to be able to manage this complicated / complexity that's happening. But there are definite known deficiencies that we have to account for. Specifically, its ability to accommodate uncertainty. We've got to figure out some way to deal with that.
Thank you. From Joe, DFP appears most applicable to development and deployment of a new capability. For example, nuclear thermal propulsion in cislunar space, a DARP's Draco project. Do you have any comments on that?
I think that it's right to say that if you had already invested in flexibility for your enterprise, and we don't need to call it even DFP, if you have a more inherently flexible, modular, interoperable, you invest in those abilities for your architecture, you are more equipped, you're more poised to be able to do something new when it comes about, whether that's respond to a new threat or accommodate a new technology or a whole new mission area. Whether or not it's right from the beginning to develop and deploy something new, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that some more.
Okay. The next one from Steve. JPL has design principles that we use to guide development and elaboration activities and products rather than rules or requirements. However, we still have high-level customer requirements. This sounds similar to DFP at a lower level. Do you agree with that?
I think so. Based on what I know, I've talked with a couple of people in JPL about DFP. I think where we immediately get a disconnect, though, is in that funding piece of it. You know, it's one thing to have these design principles and kind of allocate them to individual programs, but where is the funding to make those a reality for the entire architecture? There's one thing to say, I want this system to be flexible and interoperable, but what if I want my entire architecture to have that same sort of flexibility, and I want to invest in what I referred to earlier as an architectural utility? Where does that funding come from? I mean, imagine a world where the majority of our budget, instead of going into mission areas, into programs, went into the architecture infrastructure that enabled you to plug those individual missions in, slide them in and out as needed. It's a very different approach. And obviously that's not the way anybody's doing it, JPL or otherwise.
Okay, next from Alan, applaud the concept. The suggestion is that a couple of changes are needed at OMB, Congress, and the political levels. In fact, that may be the major stumbling block, budget dollar competition and outrage-based failure acquisitions drive cost accountant style risk avoidance behaviors in DC. What cultural changes are needed on the national political scene?
Wow, yeah. I'd love to say, hey, we're at 10 o'clock, we're out of time, can't answer that. But that's just, that would be an excuse, because that's a really hard question that gets to the fundamental nature of the challenge. And people know that we have these issues with budgeting and programmatics. All I can say is it looks like there's awareness of this issue and there is the beginnings of meaningful change. We talk about, look at program elements. There are, or traditionally have been, hundreds of different program elements coming into a space, or I'll say AF space and then SMC. And there is an attempt to try to collapse these into a much smaller number. That in itself is a huge change in how we approach budgeting and accountability. And so I don't know if that's a cultural change or a process, governance, bureaucratic change, but that's the kind of thing that needs to change at the Space Force level. And then on the national political scene, I'm not even going to touch that.
With good reason. From Fernando, so the emphasis seems naturally to development of platforms capable of supporting a range of complex applications rather than building one-time solutions as it is done now. Question.
Yes, yeah, and I skipped over this, but if you look at the very basic premise of designing for changeability, which was the inspiration for designing for principles, they have this hypothesis that says, why does a product end? Why does its life end? And is it because it stops working, or is it because it can no longer adapt to a changing environment? And so this whole idea of, do we build fixed solutions to our best guess today, or do we build less optimized solutions that are more capable of adapting to a range of possibilities? Which way do we want to go? It all depends on the degree of VUCA. If it's not VUCA, it makes all the sense in the world to optimize and assume that today's solution and problem is going to be the same and will last a long time. If it's highly VUCA, that's a terrible assumption, and you should not build or design systems that way.
Great, thank you. The next one from Steve. Aren't there flexibility / robustness metrics that could be generated and become actual requirements?
Absolutely. And how are we doing on time? Is it okay to stay on? I can stay on, but is that all right with our hosts and Corcom? And Sarah, that question's probably mostly for you. Is that okay to keep going, or do we have a hard cutoff?
We're okay to keep going.
Okay. All right, I'll keep talking away. Yes, there absolutely are metrics for flexibility. Robustness, I'm not as familiar with. Maybe someone on the line or on the chat can weigh in on that, but flexibility has literally dozens of potential metrics out there. Most of them end up being tied back to modularity, which is a little bit easier to measure. But yeah, there are metrics for some of these things. Survivability is another one where we mostly have good metrics for it. We just choose not to actually implement them.
The next question from Alan, in reference to Bill Bishop's accountability concerns, reestablishing a true partnership approach at the contract level is essential. Do you have a comment on that?
I'll just nod my head and concur. Yeah, it's become too adversarial in many instances. And maybe you could argue that if we had competition, that would antagonize that further, but I don't think it would. I think there's healthy competition, and the antagonization then becomes between the participants, and the government could, in the contractor competition, the government can kind of stay above the fray to some extent.
From Al, is it reasonable to define user stories or use cases as the reference documents for user engagement and also agile development?
Absolutely.
These are useful for DEM modeling specifically.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a fantastic way to manage some of the exchange, and increasingly important as we move into a more digitized environment.
From Jack, do you see this system or principles aligned with it being used more commonly in newer aerospace organizations, startups, and quote new space groups rather than NASA Space Force and the big aerospace corporations?
So I think the question you're getting to, Jack, is if we were to make a significant change in capability development, are there certain organizations and actors that would be more inclined to accept that? I think that's what you're getting at, and I think absolutely, we have a lot of entrenched ways of doing things in some parts of our enterprise, and there are other parts that are just all about doing things new and differently and have a much different risk posture. And I don't think that's necessarily bad, actually. That could be something that we leverage as part of our deliberate acquisition strategies, where we have a capability we want to go for, and we give a chunk of it to a part of the enterprise that is really good at maybe the more traditional approach, but we also we challenge these other aggressive entities to come up with a solution as well on a much shorter timeline and at lower costs. And again, they're competing against each other, and the more that certain entities succeed over time, the more work they're going to get.
And the last two questions, the first one being from Bill, what do you recommend to keep Celerity Cycle's operations and deliveries focused on total lifecycle costs? I'm not sure.
That's interesting. Because I think the point that Bill's getting to is there may be some perverse incentives there where, if it's all about speed and getting it done as quickly as possible, that could come at the cost of doing something that's dumb in the long run. Two immediate responses to that would be, yeah, how's that different than today? We routinely, we pay lip service to total life cycle costs because there are legal mandates to do so, but we absolutely do not do it. We routinely make decisions based on what's right for today's budget and today's programmatics as opposed to what's right in the long run. And we see that with flexibility investments all the time. And then the other is, if that is the world we kind of live in, where we are necessarily short-sighted for a number of reasons, if you're going to live in that world, the better thing to do is to have shorter cycles of development so that you can recover from that. And it doesn't really matter what that life cycle is, that sustainment operations phase. If it's only 1 to 3 years, then you're not living with the consequences of that, as opposed to a 15 to 20 year operations and sustainment phase where you're stuck with it.
And then the last one, have you thought about using a social system model for DFP?
I have not, and I'm not sure what that means. So I can't make out the name. There's some weird characters in it. It starts Jarga. If you're online and able to unmute and you'd like to clarify, please feel free to speak up.
Hello, this is Jargo. We are a company engaged in the so-called social system engineering, and you may know about this INCOSI initiative on smart city, and we are being a part of that project, and we are using this the social system model for building the so-called reference model for smart cities. And I just thought this model can be some useful for your project or for your DFP. If you are not familiar, I would encourage you to contact with this INCOSI Smart City initiatives,
Okay.
or you can contact me so we can have more information.
I am not familiar, and that is exactly what I'd like to. I appreciate that. Let me go ahead and put my email in the chat so that everybody has that if anybody wants to contact me.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And I believe that is the end of our questions. If anyone has any final questions that may not have been put in the chat, now would be the time. Okay, then with that, Erin, do you have any final comments before I close out?
No, other than thank you everybody for your time. I appreciate everybody's participation, and thank you, Alex and Sarah and CorpCom for your support as well.
Thank you for bringing this topic, organizing the workshop, and organizing this outbrief together. As mentioned, the slides will be available following the closing of this outbriefing. The recording will be made available on our site on the Aerospace YouTube channel after review. We appreciate your feedback, so you all will be receiving an email to fill out a quick survey. It should only take a few moments, minutes. Finally, if you have not done so already, registration for the final event is still available. And I'd also encourage you to keep a lookout for information on our next year's events that will be starting October of this year. And with that, thank you for attending. That includes the outbriefing for the Design for Principles workshop. We wish everyone a wonderful day. Thank you.